Chapter 12 Texas in Transition. The 1960s ushered in a quarter century of change in Texas, an era during which the state's politics seemed to move beyond their parochial past. The economy reached new heights, and women and minorities made successful bids for rights long denied them. These changes seem largely positive, and some of them can be traced directly or indirectly to the role of Lyndon B. Johnson, who ascended to the U.S. presidency after the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas. Yet many of these changes were also paradoxical. Although Johnson's enormous influence served as a moderating influence on the Texas Democratic Party, and in many ways enabled the growth of its liberal wing, it also elicited a conservative backlash that fueled the growth of the Republican Party in Texas, a trend that culminated in the election of Republican Bill Clements to the governorship in 1978. The 1960s was dominated by Lyndon Johnson on the national level and John Connally on the state level. Although Johnson failed to secure the Democratic nomination for president in the election of 1960, John F. Kennedy offered him the vice presidential nomination. To the surprise of many, Johnson accepted. Meanwhile, Republicans nominated seasoned politician and two-term Vice President Richard M. Nixon for president. In Texas, Allen Shivers organized Democrats for Nixon, while radical conservatives decried Kennedy's Catholicism and the civil rights planks of the Democratic platform. In an extremely close race, Johnson won the senatorial race and the vice presidency as a result of cross-filling. Allegations of election tainting of votes from South Texas remained unproven. However, there was never any doubt that the selection of Johnson as a running mate had ensured Kennedy's victory in the South. Even so, the Republican Party looked upon the results of the 1960 election with optimism. Never had a Republican candidate received more votes in Texas. John Tower became a strong contender in the 1961 special election to replace Johnson in the Senate against some very well-known liberal Democrats and a Democrat conservative. Meanwhile, Johnson's protege John Connally won the governorship in early 1963. John F. Kennedy traveled to Texas in November of that same year to try to patch up a long-brewing quarrel between Lyndon Johnson and Ralph Yarborough. An assassin's bullet changed the direction of Texas politics. Johnson became president, but his administration was soon mired in an unpopular war that destroyed his vision of a great society. In Texas, Connally succeeded in fostering economic growth, increasing university building programs and faculty salaries, increasing tourism, and attracting out-of-state industry. A major criticism voiced by the liberals was that Connally's method of taxation was regressive and that economic expansion excluded minorities and the poor. They were also annoyed at his control of the state party machinery. In the midst of the Vietnam War, Johnson's surprise announcement that he would not seek a second full term as president offered opportunities for conservative Democrats who won hard-fought primaries by appealing to middle and high-income voters to edge out candidates who had won the support of African Americans, lower-income whites, and Mexican Americans. The 1970 election witnessed the high point of conservative Democratic success in Texas. Federal intervention hastened the political modernization of the state. Baker versus Carr in 1962 and Reynolds versus Sims in 1964 mandated that legislative reapportionment target the principle of one man, one vote, thus strengthening both minority voices and the Republican Party in Texas. Another challenge to the white male elite came with the ratification of the 24th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which abolished the poll tax in federal elections. The 26th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 eliminated strategies that had diluted the potential voting strength of racial and ethnic minorities. World War II had a great impact on Mexican Americans and African Americans who had fought for democracy abroad only to have it denied to them back home. Black organizations like the Progressive Voters League and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People instituted lawsuits against suffrage restrictions and gerrymandering. Barbara Jordan became the first African American woman to serve in the state Senate, the first woman to give a keynote address at a National Party convention, and the first black congresswoman from Texas and the South. Her eloquence and her integrity continued to inspire Americans of all races. De jure segregation also came to an end, not through lengthy court cases, but through sit-ins, boycotts, protests, and demonstrations. Texas experienced few violent confrontations, but the white backlash ensured that Texas would not entirely desegregate. Rampant unemployment and unequal access to educational and professional opportunities persisted into the next decade. Organizations like LULAC and the GI Forum mobilized the Mexican American community during Henry B. Gonzalez's campaign for a governor in 1958. These became Viva Kennedy clubs in 1960. When Kennedy failed to appoint Hispanics to federal posts, the Political Association of Spanish Organizations, PASO, was formed. PASO and the Teamsters played a role in electing an entire slate of Mexican American candidates to the City Council of Crystal City. When a new coalition was elected 2 years later, the old order ceased to exist. A broader and more intense political movement was taking shape. The fragmented Chicano movement could not resolve their ideological differences. The more radical elements remained in Raza Unida party. The moderate factions preferred more legalistic methods and worked within the system. The Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, an outgrowth of the movement, instituted legal challenges. Women also became more politically involved throughout the 1960s and 1970s, still confronting many of the same problems that had plagued them throughout the 1950s: gender-defined jobs, unequal wages, lack of social and economic opportunities. Women did benefit from new birth control techniques and a feminist awareness that encouraged delaying marriage to pursue careers and educational goals. The federal government's intervention was beneficial, especially in addressing the discrimination of women in the workplace. In 1972, Sarah Weddington, a lawyer from Texas, won the landmark Roe v. Wade case, in which the U.S. Supreme Court struck down state laws forbidding abortions during the first trimester. Even though Frances Sissy Fairchild unsuccessfully sought the gubernatorial seat 10 years earlier, 698 women won public offices in 1982, including Ann Richards as state treasurer and then governor in 1990. Although women and minorities made major inroads, Preston Smith's ambivalence made him a weak governor. Governor Smith's small successes included a minimum wage law, increased spending for vocational education, and the development of medical schools in Houston and Lubbock. But after his re-election in 1970, key administration figures were implicated in financial malfeasance. A major scandal erupted involving Frank Sharp, Houston's banker and insurance company executive. Sharp's scheme involved granting loans to state officials with the understanding that they would purchase stocks to be resold later at a huge profit. In 1971, the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, filed criminal and civil charges against key participants in the scheme, including Speaker Gus Muscher and two top aides who were convicted and sentenced to 5 years probation. Sharp was convicted of violating federal banking and security laws. Candidates even remotely connected to the scandal were defeated in the 1972 contests by more moderate Democrats, Republicans, or other reform candidates. Overall, 72 new members to the House and 15 to the Senate were elected. Muscher, running for re-election, lost, as did Governor Smith. Lawmakers in 1973 passed a series of reforms that required state officials and politicians to disclose their personal and campaign finances and required lobbyists to register with the state government. Dolph Briscoe, a millionaire rancher, won the gubernatorial seat, and Frances Sissy Franthenhold, who had denounced the speaker's exonerating report, came in second. Ramsey Munoz, La Raza Unida's nominee for governor, garnered 200,118 votes. Democratic politics of the 1970s and 1980s stressed party harmony, modernization, and inclusion above all else. The tensions of the 1960s lessened considerably, and the party held the governorship until 1979, when William P. Clement's victory illustrated the state's Republican Party's increasing strength. Regardless of the party in power, Texas conservatives dominated the Texas governorship. In 1978, William P. Clements became the first Republican governor of Texas since Reconstruction. However, by 1980, the economy weakened and the unemployment rate rose to more than 6%. Democrat Mark White took the gubernatorial seat from Clements, showing a progressive bent in securing health care for indigent workers, workers' compensation, and unemployment benefits for farm workers, tougher pesticide regulations, as well as educational reform. The next economic downturn translated into another political upheaval with Clement's re-election in 1986. The post-World War II trends towards more leisure time for middle and lower classes and a wide variety of ways to spend it continued in the 1960s and beyond. Sports remained more of a religion than a pastime for millions of Texans, and for many of them, sports were synonymous with football. The rise of television and the state's growing prosperity made college football accessible to a broader audience than ever. Leading in popularity was the storied Southwest Conference, whose greatest achievement came during the reign of Darrell Royal, coach of the University of Texas from 1957 to 1976. Professional football cast its spell on Texans in the 1960s. Texas millionaires Lamar Hunt and K.S. Bud Adams helped found the American Football League in 1960 and secured franchises for Dallas and Houston. The same year, oilman Clint Murchison Jr. received a National Football League expansion franchise for Dallas, the Cowboys. Other professional sports in Texas included a strong minor league baseball program throughout the 20th century. The state's warm and sunny climate made the Texas League an important place for the training of future major leaguers. Texas acquired a second major league franchise in 1972 when the Washington Senators moved to Arlington and became the Texas Rangers, but neither the Rangers nor the Houston Astros would enjoy much success for many years to come. The quarter century after 1960 marked a period of transition in entertainment, culture, and the arts in Texas. By the 1970s, symphony, opera, and ballet companies existed in all the state's major cities, and some of these were beginning to establish national or even international reputation. In 1970, after 10 frustrating years in Nashville, Willie Nelson moved to Austin, where he grew his hair long, dressed in faded jeans, and began making music his own way. The music scene that began in Austin in the early 1970s attracted other self-styled musical outlaws, among them Waylon Jennings, a singer-songwriter from Littlefield. Progressive country, as the new Austin music was being called, remained a well-kept secret nationally until 1979, when Nelson's Red-Headed Stranger album, a collection of sparsely arranged ballads, rocketed to the top of the country and pop charts. A second album the following year, a collaboration with Waylon Jennings entitled Wanted, The Outlaws, became the best-selling country album in history. Austin City Limits, a television program founded in 1974, exposed the Texas music scene to the nation. Country and Western music is nationally represented by Willie Nelson, Jerry Jeff Walker, Michael Murphy, and the swing band Asleep at the Wheel. Nashville continued to make other Texans famous too. Prominent performers include George Jones, Ray Price, Tanya Tucker, Kenny Rogers, and George Strait. Fort Worth's Ornette Coleman leaves his mark in creating free jazz in the late 1950s. Clarinetist John Carter is perhaps even better known. His 5-album recording Roots and Folklore, Episodes in the Development of American Folk Music, traces African American history through jazz. Texas long had provided popular subject matter for television and film, a trend that continued into the modern era. In the 1970s, the nighttime soap opera Dallas took the nation by storm, as the devious Texas oil tycoon J.R. Ewing, played by Weatherford native Larry Hagman, became the villain that everyone loved to hate. Larry McMurtry, the state's best-known writer, serves as an example of the state's transition from rural to an urban society, and of a writer who grappled with the impact of that transition on people's lives. While McMurtry's novels of the 1960s had been set in the rural and small-town Texas, in the 1970s the work began to focus on urban themes. Then, in something of a literary surprise, McMurtry published Lonesome Dove in 1985, a long-lasting Pulitzer Prize-winning novel about two ex-rangers on an epic cattle drive.